Welcome to this Sustainable Finance Masterclass session. Today we have a tremendous speaker with us. We have Will Oulton, who has a distinguished career in the sustainable finance industry. Will has been with many of the leading investment businesses in sustainable finance and also has taken key roles within some of the policy organisations across the sustainable finance industry. So Will and I are going to begin as we should begin, which is with your career and how you came into working in responsible and sustainable finance. What was it that led you to choose this type of career, would you say?
Well, the honest answer is a little bit by accident. And what happened was I'd spent 3 years between 1998 and 2001 in the US setting up and running FTSE's business there. And when I came back to the UK, I was asked to look after this new index product called the FTSE for Good Index, which I'd never heard of. It was unique in many ways because it was the first time FTSE had ever looked at criteria to develop an index that were not financial or market cap weighted or liquidity, traditional sort of financial metrics that benchmarks have used for decades. So I didn't know what this was, and it wasn't going so well at the time. So I was asked to look after it and develop it and give it some momentum and a bit of profile. So I had to learn what this was all about, and that took me into the realm of the world of sort of ESG. So looking at the environmental and social characteristics, performance, and the quality of corporate governance of companies to sit alongside those traditional benchmark metrics. So we worked with a group of industry experts, as they were at that time, and this is back in 2001, so there wasn't many, to develop a set of criteria to select companies for this index. And at that time, there was very few companies that were really disclosing anything substantial about their sustainability performance, their sustainability-related management systems. Very few had policies that you could see. So with that, we started to kind of develop this benchmark to encourage companies to disclose more. Because without disclosure, and we'll talk about this in our conversation, disclosure features large in the regulatory environment today that we sit in. But at the time, without information, investors couldn't make a decision about what was the inherent risk from the sustainability performance of these companies. But at that time, this was a really small part of the market. There were a small number of ethical funds in existence. There was a lack of data of any metrics that really were of any use. The quality was really poor. So it was the kind of a beginning of my entry and awareness of this. And after sort of working on this for around 6 or 7 months, I just thought, how can we really look at the value at risk of companies without assessing these really important factors? Because who would want to invest their money in a company where you knew the quality of directors and there was poor corporate governance? Mm-hmm. There's been so many corporate failures due to poor corporate governance. I mean, how can we not look at companies that are not respecting their stewardship of the environment, polluting, etc., and not assessing the value of companies? So I kind of decided to sort of steer my career into the sustainable investment area, and it was by chance, and it was actually beginning to work on this new benchmark. I mean, there was only one other around, a Dow Jones Sustainability at that time, and it sort of piqued my interest, and I thought this has got to be an area of this industry that's got to grow, get more attention, and a few years later, that really wasn't happening. So I thought, oops, have I made a bit of a mistake here? But over time, as we know today, it's become a huge part of the industry and the market.
Right. So just to be clear, so FTSE launched those benchmarks in the early 2000s. And at the time, what were they trying to achieve? That was a new development within their business. What prompted them, do you think, to make that step or take that change?
Regulation. It was the Pensions Act. So the then MP Stephen Timm introduced the Pensions Act, which required UK pension funds to state whether they took into account ethical, environmental, social and governance considerations in their realisation and retention of assets, was the language I think that was used. So FTSE thought that is an opportunity to create some benchmarks that would reflect this potential change in asset owners in the UK and their interest in this part of the market. So that's why the index was originally created. It was that change in regulation, the Pensions Act, that stimulated the doing and building that benchmark series.
Okay, and benchmarks are obviously very important, I suppose, because that means that institutional investors and other asset owners start to make comparisons between the performance of the portfolios that they manage with those benchmarks. So what was the impact that the benchmarks started to have? Could you explain?
Well, initially, the interest came from the companies themselves. Because the companies that made the cut, so they passed the criteria, which were relatively low at that time, for the reasons we just talked about, I mean, the limited disclosures. The ones that weren't in got pretty angry. The ones that were in started advertising their presence in the FTSE for Good index in mainstream media. I remember being called by the chairman of a well-known supermarket brand who did not make the first cut of the entry criteria, and he went ballistic at me saying, how can our competitor X be in and we're not? And the answer was, well, you're not disclosing the information we need. Now, 6 months later, when the review that index came round, for sure they were in, because they suddenly provided a lot more information that was required. So in the early years, the FTSE Good Index had a really big impact on companies in upping their game in terms of disclosing their sustainability credentials, their practices, their processes, and their policies. And that sort of continues today, because that index, the standards rise over time. So companies can't just say we're in and that's it. It became a bit like a Hotel California benchmark, where companies, once they were in, they did not want to fall out. They really did not want to fall out, because they had a PR problem if that was the case. So it became very effective at influencing companies in the early years. And then gradually we saw some particularly structured products linked to the performance of the index start to build. And then eventually there were some passive funds that sort of tracking the index. But it was companies in the early phases that really reacted to it.
Okay, that's very interesting. So it's influencing corporate behaviour because there's this willingness to want to comply and be seen as an effective corporate citizen, I suppose, through inclusion into the index. But then also you started to see the emergence of investment funds. I think Legal & General were a relatively early adopter in having a FTSE for Good tracker product. And back in the 2000s, trackers weren't all that big in the UK. They'd already taken off in the US, but they're a growing part of the investment landscape. So that became, I suppose, a way in which the benchmark was having an impact through funds adopting the ethical benchmark in a sense, yes.
I mean, the weight of assets tracking, it never, in those early first 10 years, never really got to an amount where you could say they're really influencing corporate behaviour. It was really the company just did not want to be falling out of that. And over time, there were more and more investment institutions who then started to create products linked to it as they saw interest in the area beginning to grow. The size of the market at that time was probably sub 2% of assets in the UK anyway, similar in other markets, but today it's magnitudes higher. So that, I think, in the UK was the beginning of the real sort of catalyst of growth in ethical investment that evolved into be sustainable or responsible investment, and the many terms we tend to use for these things today.
Okay. And then moving forward a bit in terms of the chronology, you then moved away from FTSE and you joined an investment group, yeah? I
moved away from FTSE and then became an investment consultant. So I started working with pension schemes as clients. I was at Mercer for a couple of years doing that, and helping asset owners really understand what was happening in this part of the market, because it wasn't only the Pensions Act that they were subject to. Around the time I moved there was the new Stewardship Code, which came into force, the first iteration of that. And a range of changes were beginning to be implemented in the regulatory framework that that asset owners were certainly subject to. So did that for a few years, and then moved into asset management as head of responsible investment, and really then working with portfolio managers across the business, looking back again at companies and what their sustainability credentials were, and how to integrate ESG into the investment discipline, really, and that's which is very, very common in institutions today.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's certainly moved from being a fairly niche activity in the early 2000s, as you described, to being very mainstream now, with most asset managers really having an ESG product and having an ESG framework that they apply. How do you view those changes? Do you think it's been successful in terms of the quality of investment products? Do you view it as a win in terms of moving capitalism towards a more sustainable model, perhaps?
Well, I think there's been lots of positives for sure, and there's been lots of drivers that have got us to where we are today. You can't discount the influence of the regulatory agenda. I mean, that's what's really driven certainly the integration of ESG into a core part of the investment discipline, which it is for many, many institutions, not only in the UK but globally today. That understanding of how these issues can influence long-term value. And with that, there was just improvements in the data sets that were available. As we talked about with the FTSE for Good, more disclosure means more information available to assess and evaluate. And then the sort of aggregators of ESG data came into the market and provided simple, easy to access information for investors. The awareness of things like climate change was just gaining public interest and investor interest, and the policy environment around the whole sort of environmental agenda was also another driver. So I think there's been many factors that we've seen, but certainly now, in the sort of early 2000s, it was an exception to see a really strong investment team and an investment institution working on this. Today, it's an exception if you can't find that. That's the change that we've seen. Every institution's got some capability and capacity around this area now. They vary. Some are better than others, as markets tend to have. The range of products is just shot through the roof. Certainly, in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, that's been the case. There's a much more greater appetite for thematic investment across the range of different ESG issues, well, not governance, but environmental and social issues. So there's more choice. There's more choice. There's better quality product, I think, in the market, and there's certainly more informed and better quality investment teams around this topic now.
Okay, very good. And then bringing things more up to date, obviously in Europe and more recently in the UK, we've seen the creation of statutory frameworks which govern disclosure and regulate the use of terminology in responsible investment funds. So perhaps you could say a little bit about that. Firstly, with the European framework, which has been in place for a number of years, and then here in the UK. So thinking about what's happened in Europe and the experience in Europe with Article 8 and Article 9 investment funds.
Yeah, that's the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation you're referring to there, which came into force in March 21, in the middle of lockdown 2. That was introduced, and I think that the story around the EU regulation, if you look globally now at the kind of ESG related regulation you're seeing emerging in different countries, you can pretty much track it back to 2 sources. One is TCFD. And the evolution of parts of TCFD into mandatory reporting and disclosure requirements. The other one is the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan, and there's replicants of that we're seeing in many different markets. The story with the EU really started in sort of 2017 with the creation of something called the High Level Expert Group on Sustainable Finance, which was set up by the Commission to advise on what to do to meet the policy goals that the EU had set. And those policy goals around sort of sustainable capital were meet the Paris Climate Agreement needs for the block, and fund the requirements around the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So one of the positives was it was clear what this stuff was trying to achieve, which is never always the case with regulation. You know, it's usually after the event, and there's no such thing as perfect regulation ever. But in this case, stakeholders could actually see what the intent was, and it was that diversion, you know, of capital away from unsustainable businesses to more sustainable business practices. And to do that, investors needed to understand what was happening within the products that they were expected to invest in. So that it's a really disclosure-based regulation. And it gave us this new categorization of funds in the EU. And you mentioned Article 8 and Article 9. I mean, Article 9 are basically sustainability-focused funds. Article 8 are sort of ESG integrated funds. And then there's something called Article 6, which is, you know, doesn't do that or might selectively do that. But I think the big change, the big impact of this regulation was that it enforced legally binding commitments on asset managers. So if you wanted to comply, or you had to comply, actually, it wasn't a choice, but to comply with the regulation, if you were selling into any EU market, you had to meet the disclosure requirements, and that meant you had to put information in the fund prospectuses, in the legal documentation that was binding. So you were on the hook for it. And that was a step change in terms of accountability. If we go back to 2001, where our story started, you could pretty much say anything you wanted about how good you were at integrating ESG or looking at sustainability in a fund without being held accountable for that. Yeah. You can't do that today. Unless you can evidence that, you're going to be running the risk of a regulatory sanction or big problem.
Well, there were prosecutions, I believe, arising from activity which was held to be fraudulent in relation to this. So there were some notable examples of criminal action, yes?
I don't know the details of any of that, but it's certainly a threat there. And in some European jurisdictions, that is part of the toolkit of the legislators, that you are legally on the hook if you get this wrong, or you mislead, deliberately mislead with information.
So what's been the impact of regulation, would you say, in Europe? Has it been effective? Has it improved the quality of investment products offered to private investors, to institutional investors? What's happened, would you say?
Well, I think the impact is it set a minimum standard for the industry which didn't exist before. As I mentioned, you could pretty much say anything you liked about your products. And within institutions, there's always this sort of tension between the portfolio management teams and then those who are tasked with selling and promoting those funds. And people who are tasked with selling and promoting the funds, they're marketers, that's their job. So they can be a little bit flamboyant with the language they might want to use. That today is a real commercial risk for any entity. So it's actually changed the internal governance processes in many institutions, because you can't have the sort of marketing and product team in the corner doing one thing and then the PMs doing their thing around the portfolio. They have to now be much more integrated, so there's a flow of information that can be evidenced, and you're not over-exaggerating how brilliant your product might be. So it set that minimum standard. So, and for the better sustainable investors, the higher quality, that's a real bonus, because it means that that they're in that area where they can communicate their credentials without having noise from those who are really just marginal, to say, to give them some credit that they're doing any of this to the quality you have seen. Does that mean better quality product? Don't know. I don't think so. I don't think it's had that impact, but it's certainly increased the availability of comparable information for investors, where they can much more easily compare and contrast fund by fund now on similar information. Pre the SFDR, that was hard to do, as you will well know, because you do that for your living. It's not easy. So it's helped it in that way, and has set this sort of minimum standard of practice for the industry, which I don't think is a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. And then thinking about the UK experience, obviously the rules here are relatively new. They were introduced at the end of last year. In fact, they're yet to be in force, but we know what they're going to look like. So just thinking about the labels and the labels that the FCA has introduced, do you think that's an effective approach? It's stylistic terms, it's almost more market orientated as a solution. It's directed very clearly at the consumer, trying to help the consumer understand what they're getting. Do you think that's the right approach to take?
Well, I think one thing, the FCA have been smart in terms of their approach to this this regulatory need, because it was a need, they couldn't not do something, was they kind of waited and watched how successful or not the EU system was. And that was a smart move, because the EU system is far from perfect. I mean, there's no such thing as perfect regulation, never will be. It was, fantastic intent, widely supported in terms of what it was trying to achieve through its policy objectives, but the implementation was chaotic, to be kind. Out of sequence, things that were required of investors to disclose were not being disclosed or needed to be disclosed yet by investee companies in these portfolios. So there was a lot of tension around that. But the main thing that happened very quickly across the industry was that these categories of funds, so you mentioned earlier Article 8 and Article 9, they became de facto labels. They were used in that way, and the regulation was not designed for that purpose at all. It's based upon disclosure standards and not the credentials or characteristics or really the investment objectives of particular products. So the FCA in the UK noted that, saw that that's what was happening, and smartly, as part of the SDR equivalent, as it's called here in the UK, part of that is the introduction of 4 labels. And we'll see how they get adopted and whether institutions are confident they can meet the criteria pertaining to each of them. But at a glance again, it's an easy way to identify groups of funds aiming to do certain things, whether they're sustainability focused funds, whether they're impact or improvers, as they call, which is essentially transition style, low carbon transition style strategies. So should be successful. It's easy to understand. We'll see come the end of July, when firms can utilise these labels, what the take-up has been. Bit of risk maybe going as an early adopter. Wait to see what your peers are doing. Certainly on some of the labels, which I think will be quite challenging. And then you overlay that with the anti-greenwashing rules and guidance that have been announced that come into force at the end of May. You've got to think very hard about how you've got an internal governance process to assure the business that you meet these criteria and not running any regulatory risk in that way. And then there'll be how commercially successful are the label funds versus the non-label funds, and that was a dynamic that we saw with the EU SFDR. There was a real sort of surge towards the sort of top end, the Article 9 and the Article 8 funds, as opposed to the sort of minimum ESG integration.
Okay, good. So in terms of the impact that we think this might have on the market, it'll certainly make communication rather easier. What we currently have is a very messy alphabet soup of all sorts of different labels and terms that are used to describe these funds. So I imagine the industry will now coalesce around the labels. We'll have more clarity around the disclosure and the information that's produced by fund groups associated with the labels, because they'll have a regulatory obligation to ensure those disclosures are clear. So is this going to be another boom then potentially for responsible investment? The FCA in the supporting literature for the introduction of this talks about a high level of interest from the general population. Certainly been my experience that people are very interested in this. Would you tend to agree that we'll see more uptake from private investors, from institutional investors as well in sustainable investing?
I think certainly for private investors, it's very usable and designed for private investors. Institutions have got a sort of different sort of approach where they'll use professional advisors in fund selection and so on. So we'll see. I think it will form part of the narrative and communication between advisors and the institutional investors. But I mean, the regulation is designed to protect the retail investor from being misled. You know, that's the whole purpose of the greenwashing regulations, that you can't say things that you can't evidence. So I think it will have a boost in interest in these products in this part of the market. I would certainly expect that. And one of the things that I've done over the years is work with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and as part of that, we commissioned a piece of research examining the kind of preferences of retail investors in Europe and the US, particularly. And what we did was we used some behavioral scientists to give people information which showed pretty much similar financial performance of products, but very different sustainability performance, to really positive, to neutral, to actually negative. And what that research found was that when presented with that information, the majority of retail investors would choose the more positive ESG sustainability profile products, even if that meant they would be a small performance sacrifice that they would expect. So I think there's a sentiment there that generally people will want their investments to be doing something positive and not harmful and negative. Mm-hmm. And the labels may well be an easy way for people to identify such products, but we'll see. I mean, time will tell with anything like this.
So looking ahead then, Will, obviously I think we both agree that what's happening here in the UK is broadly going to be very positive in terms of building further interest and weight of capital into responsible investment funds. But looking at other jurisdictions, looking at the US and what's happening across the world, I'd love to hear your comments on that, perhaps.
Well, I think there's certainly headwinds right now. We're in this phase of questioning the merit and the value of sustainable investment. And in the US, the whole issue has been kind of politicized, and it's become a kind of proxy for the sort of red, blue state culture wars that we're seeing in the US. I expect that will fade away after this election cycle, hopefully. But it's very real right now, and there are certainly US Republican states who are taking money away from institutions who are clearly integrating ESG into their investment processes for running that money. It's madness, if you look at it through the sensible kind of lens. But that's reality of what's happening right now. But these challenges have come and gone over the last 20, 30 years. I mean, I've seen it so many times, and we're just in that phase right now of where there's a lot of challenges. I think it's because of the growth and the success and the regulation that's forcing, a lot more discipline around how investors look at and institutions deal with these issues. Yeah. So there is that sort of bit of pushback going on. One of the things in Europe which is a concern, is just this democracy voting period we're in. So there's EU elections in June. We've got the UK elections to come at some point. We've got the US in November. So there is a bit of concern about which way will this sort of swing, to the right or the left. And early indications in the EU are that it pretty much stay the same, so it won't have a detrimental impact. But what it has done is concern about that is it's stopped any development around further regulation or further developments in this area. They're paused right now. And the same thing is happening in the US, where institutions and part of the government system is not developing things like natural capital related work because of the wait and see till the election, because otherwise that stuff could just be thrown in the bin. So it's definitely having an impact, slowing down development. It doesn't appear to be causing problems with investor appetite for this, and I think as we continue to see the impacts of climate and some of the social dimensions of that, and it becomes much more visible, then I think that core of interest is still solid. But there's a lot of noise around right now that needs to be dealt with, and we're back in this sort of phase of the industry's sort of behaviour where there seems to be a higher burden of proof on the value and merit of sustainable investment than you see compared to other types of strategies, such as hedge funds, for example. And we have that. It comes and goes, and we're in it's here right now. So I think it's noise. I think it will fade out at the end of this election cycle.
Okay. So just focusing for a minute on an area of interest around impact investing. So impact is a term widely used in responsible investment industry. What's being suggested, I think, to a private retail investor is that their capital is having a direct impact on the world around us, perhaps through cleaner water, greater quantities of clean water, or reduced CO2 emissions. But that's a very difficult thing to prove, and there is a tension there with what's been said about greenwashing. How do you think that might play out? And what's your view on the provability, if that's the word, of impact in public market investing, where purchases of secondary or shares purchased via the secondary market?
I think there's quite a bit of peril in using that term, certainly for listed security funds. It'll be helped by the fact there's a sustainable impact or sustainability impact label. So that gives some sense of confidence that there is, for example, a theory of change that is a requirement of that label, that the product manufacturer, the investor is got to disclose and show how that's working. But the peril bit is that it is difficult to prove the influence on company behaviour and therefore the impact that company's having as a minority shareholder or in a minority bondholder. And that's where I think the difficulty lies, is that you've got to be brave and have a very high degree of conviction that you've got an influence on that business or that portfolio of companies that you can evidence. So I think the impact label is the one I would expect to have the least take up when it's launched. I think everybody will be looking at each other, seeing who's gone first with that. Not to say that it's not valid, but I think there's question marks around, can you really claim impact as a sub 1% shareholder in a business? And that's a valid question, and managers should be held to account and quizzed on that when they're promoting that as a key feature of their particular fund.
Yes, as you use the word peril, I think it is problematic, particularly because of the way it's viewed by the end investor. It's a difficult and complex conversation to have with an individual around how public equity markets actually function, and the reality being that there is no new capital being provided to a particular company. So where that conversation often leads is to talk about the wider ecosystem that's being supported, or the value, I suppose, of funds championing those ideals and perhaps bringing the rest of the market along with them. But when you start to describe all that, you run the risk of sounding slightly nebulous, frankly, as if you can't pin down what's being meant by all of that. Would you agree?
Well, I think that's the crux of the greenwashing challenge now, and avoiding being nebulous and avoiding being vague, and ensuring that what you're presenting and communicating about your product is substantiated by evidence that you can exhibit and show. And I think that's where the challenge will be. There'll be a lot of internal compliance eyes on that. There'll be a lot of kind of legal eyes on the documentation around that. So I don't think we'll see a real flourish of impact labels, certainly in the early months of the implementation of the SDR, because it's the one that's always fraught. It's the most difficult description of a fund, particularly in the listed space. Many private market funds, you can you can see the connection between the investment and the activities of the companies and portfolios. It's much easier there, but that's a very small proportion of the market, and there's very few relatively investment opportunities in that space. When it comes to all the liquidity issues, listed space, I think it'll be very interesting to see how that develops around this sort of impact label and the and how particular managers present those products.
Well, terrific. That was really excellent, Will. Thank you for that. I mean, you really talked us through your very interesting career in the industry and how regulation has had this major impact and what we can expect to see looking forward. Always extremely difficult to make predictions, you would agree, but certainly a time of great change and where the industry will be shaped by the new regulation and the regulation that's going to be implemented here in the UK just this year. So thank you again. Thank you for your time.
You're very welcome. It's a period of fascinating change, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts.